Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Taboo, a novel, by Kim Scott, narrated by Kim Scott.
Dedication to Ryan Brown, Ngan Mun. Part 1. Old Haunts. Our hometown was a massacre place. People called it Taboo. They said it is haunted and you will get sick if you go there. Others just bragged. We shot you and poisoned the waterholes so you never come back. We had heard all this, and we heard it again as we lifted ourselves from the riverbed and went back up the hill into town. Some of you may wish to imagine our decaying flesh, our shuffling tread, and a collective moan emanating from our slack jaws, as if we were the undead indeed. It was never like that, and we are hardly alone in having been clumsy, in having stumbled and struggled to properly speak and breathe and find our place again. But we were never hungry for human flesh or revenge of any kind. Our people gave up on that payback stuff a long time ago, because we always knew death is only one part of a story that is forever beginning. And so this story will start here, where the wind has suddenly dropped and the sun glowers in the eerie red light of a dying sandstorm. The many falling sand grains whisper. Thunder crashes and rumbles down the rocky river valley, and lightning glitters on the chrome of a semi-trailer cresting, where the highway chokes to become the plummeting main street of this little town in Western Australia's great southern, Keepalup. The old name means place of water, or perhaps welling. But the signpost points to a cluster of buildings either side of a dry old creek emerging from a low, near barren range on Western Australia's southern coastal plain. The truck driver, surprised by the sudden descent, touches the brake. His foot goes flat to the floor. Tries to change gear. Cogs clash and grate. The truck's chrome glints, tarpaulins tremble, wheels roll faster and faster. Propelled by tons of wheat freewheeling down the street, the driver's bowels loosen, his gear stick flops about. The poor man leans on the horn, and he, passenger and truck, make a wailing chorus. In the pub, frothy heads of beer shiver with the trucks passing. The numbers on the speedometer continue to rise. A group of people have gathered on a patch of grass beside the local history museum. They are here for the opening of a peace park. A large, bald and well-dressed man leaving the edge of the group suddenly sees the charging truck and scurries from its path, arms flailing and little feet a blur. An older man, refusing to be distracted by the tons of glass and metal rushing between them, stares after the bald one, but all the other faces, like flowers following the sun, track the vehicle as it thunders by museum, town hall, cafe, supermarket, school. No child is harmed. Also unharmed, drunks fall out of the top pub, their gaze, along with that of the Peace Park attendees, trained upon the truck's dusty, wagging tailgate. It seems the runaway vehicle has created a void that vision is obliged to fill. The driver's eyes, by contrast, dart here and there seeking an exit, an escape clause, some soft shoulder to roll on. As if tempted by the scent of fuel, the truck veers briefly towards the roadhouse, then weaves back and, departing the other side of the bitumen, snaps a railing and takes down a succession of small trees and shrubs as it bucks and bounces across the floodplain. Slowed at last by deep, coarse sand, it makes one last dramatic gesture, reminding one observer of a feebly breaching whale, and rises into the air a little before falling on its side. Birds flap into the sky, screeching indignation. The motor hiccups, stops. Wheels spin on, as good wheels do. From a distance, the aloof view, say, of those birds, a pattern is dissolving and reforming again. Bunches of people at the museum, pub, cafe, roadhouse, the little park, then all moving together and flowing down the street. A car stutters ahead, pulls up at the road edge of the river crossing. A bystander, perhaps even you, dear reader, might anticipate an explosion, a great ball of flame, but there is no explosion. Already, the so recently startled birds are beginning to resettle among the slow and incrementally turning leaves of the patient trees. A human figure emerges from the window of the truck's cab door. A girl, a young woman perhaps, standing easily on the side of the cab, she bends to help someone exit. A strong young thing, then, athletic. The other person seems much older or injured. Having been helped, hauled from the cab, he immediately sits down on its still closed door. Hurt? Tired? He looks around, back into the cab, and then tentatively makes his way down after the young woman, though less nimbly. The two of them stamp their feet on solid ground, as if reassuring themselves. They listen to the wheels spinning, and a luxurious whispering sound. Wheat, slowly spilling from the vehicle. Come close. Closer. A small pile of wheat is growing beside the trailer, fed by a thin, grainy spout from the upper corner of the tarpaulin. Golden, it has both the look and sound of great wealth. The tarp slips a little, so that the thin stream becomes a golden shoot, and then the tarpaulin pulls away like an upside-down stage curtain, and a wide, low wave of wheat makes the girl step back once, twice, 3 times. She stops, transfixed by something in the trailer as the wheat continues to flow around and behind her. Imagine a figure sitting in a deep and rapidly draining bath. Head and shoulders appear, then the upper torso, knees. In the trailer, beginning with the dome of a dark skull, a figure is being revealed. This figure slides a little, shifts. The tarpaulin slips again. The golden grain continues to flow across the ground. The figure begins to rise. It must be the moving grain, but it seems as if the legs lever it upright, and it steps from the upturned trailer and stands, swaying with the high weight of its skull. The girl, the figure, they stand facing one another, feet invisible beneath the grain. The wheat dust, the light of the sandstorm, the after effects of the accident. What is it the girl sees? Something like a skeleton, but not of bone. At least, not only bone. The limbs are timber. The skull is timber too, dark and burnished, and ivory dentures, stained as if by chomping, inhaling, gustatory human life, grin exultation. A gauze of gold dust and light motes swirls from its broad shoulders and around the rippling cage of its ribs. Long shanks lever the pelvis, itself a solid thing of smooth river stone and timber glowing at its centre of gravity. Kneecaps too are smooth stone, but the rest is bone and polished timber and woven grass, seeds and brightly coloured feathers and even fencing wire. Cords of sinew, of neatly knotted fishing line, and, is it human hair, meet moistly at each mobile joint. The figure sways toward the girl, led by the heavy skull, and then glides to her, arms low and open, each beautifully defined and delicate hand held palm up. Its whole being is a smile. Hands clasp, firm, warm, uncalloused. And now the wind gathers strength. A melody plays across the visual rhythm of those ribs. Hollowed, meticulously carved spaces begin to whistle, and timber limbs begin an accompaniment. Thunder cracks and booms, it rumbles in the riverbed. The figure teeters, begins to move, to slowly fall apart and maybe tumble. We thought to tell a story with such momentum, a truck careering down a hillside, thunder in a rocky riverbed, a skeleton tumbling to the ground. There must be at least one brave and resilient character at its centre, one of us. And the story will speak of magic in an empirical age, of how our dead will return, transformed, to support us again and from within. One may as well begin, once upon a time, except this is no fairy tale. It is drawn from real life. We remember Dan Horton. He will seem a stereotype, even a caricature, this stooped and elderly man in faded toweling hat, sensible clothes, and laceless boots. Real life has its stereotypes and caricatures. Dan Horton was one of those rural men who, in the middle of conversation, will suddenly crouch and, clearing a little plot of dirt with the heel of his hand, draw diagrams with a stick or calloused finger. So, once upon a time, Dan Horton squinted through his kitchen window into the heart of light. Out there, beyond his sight, the earth, having been stripped and raked and poked, was desiccating in the wind. Sand rose from the raised ground and was swept away in clouds, persisting only in fine ridges beneath the fencing wires and heaped against posts, trees, dead sheep, or indeed any lifeless body. This wind gives the coastal dunes their sharp edges and stings the flesh of anyone caught in the paddocks. Sunlight streamed through the streaked window and glinted on the stainless steel sink. Dan's wife, Janet, had died 2 months ago, yet her clothes were still in the wardrobe, her slippers under the bed. She'd left him. Passed, people say today, not passed away. She has passed. Dan had only just changed the bed sheets. It was the first time he'd attempted this particular household task. He supposed that men today helped their wives change the sheets, helped with the cooking and the dishes and all of that. Breastfed too, probably. Dan had seen there were these lady milking machines. His adult son had not been at Janet's funeral. Overseas, perhaps? Married, even? He had little idea where or how that young man lived, not since he had responded to Dan's ultimatum, my way or the highway, by walking away from God, the farm and the family. Of course Dan regretted his words. The bed sheets had helped Dan dream of Janet, and each morning she faded away and he had to once again reckon the absence in his world. The phone rang, startling him. Hot tea slopped down his shirt front. One hand holding the shirt away from his skin, he put down the cup, plucked the telephone from its cradle and pressed it to his ear, grimacing as the wet shirt fell against his skin. He began untangling the telephone cord, an action repeated so many times it had become in itself a comfort. "Dan? Dan?" It was his brother, Malcolm. "I'm sorry, thinking. You know her voice is still on your answering machine?" He did. He did indeed. He pressed on. There was something he must tell his brother. "You remember Tilly? One of those babies we fostered for a time. She was walking and talking and—" Her mother took her back. "Well," said Malcolm, "I remember how Janet was when she left. The father was a rapist or something, wasn't he? That was a terrible year. Wheat wasn't much more than $70 a ton. Tilly, she's coming to Kerpalup. There's a group of Aborigines coming for the Peace Park opening. She's with them? It's her family. Her mother was white. Distant relations, perhaps, the way we think of things, but they have a strong sense of family, Malcolm. You know that, and, well, I wish they'd look after their families, that's all. Think about the children you and Janet fostered. There should have been no need, and who of them ever contacts you, eh? Well, this one has. Someone on her behalf, anyway. Where they staying? Caravan Park, Hopetown. Be here some days, apparently. Why? Told you, the Peace Park. Something about some stories, dream time, language or something. You know, culture stuff. Malcolm, I think they want to visit Coconera. They want to come onto the farm. The massacre, he said. Oh, I wish they wouldn't use that word, massacre. Dan continued. They wanted to reconcile themselves to what happened here, to have their elders come back particularly. Of course it was a long time ago, and, here Dan and Malcolm agreed, there was no real evidence of any more than a few Aborigines being killed. Undoubtedly, some were. They both remembered finding a skull wedged by the rock waterhole when they were still children, on their own property. You could see what people meant about skulls grinning, all those teeth. In Dan's memory the skull was sunlit bright. Janet's body would be rotting by now, putrefying. The coffin would keep the insects, the worms and maggots away for a while. Her car was still in the shed. He would have to get rid of that too. Taboo, isn't it? His brother's voice in his ear. For them to come here, I mean. Dan said nothing. He waited, impatient for Malcolm to go on, but, as was the way between them, each imbued in the same family tradition, he remained silent. There were often these long silences in their conversation. Tethered, Dan stretched the telephone cord as far as possible, and moving to where he could avoid looking directly into the heart of light. He was thinking of how the dead might yet return. Hoping and wishing, he said, I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. Malcolm responded automatically. Ezekiel 37. It was a game they'd played since childhood. One brother would quote a Bible passage, the other give the reference. Resurrection. Ah, Dan. There was another of those protracted silences. Remember those two old Aboriginal women? I've been thinking about them, Malcolm. Gins, we used to say. Married Irish twins. How we used to treat that family. They must all be related to them, the people coming. Tilly must have been too. Must be. She was long gone, course, the old girl. And Tilly a baby, almost a toddler when she left, and never a hair on her head hurt. She thrived with us. Janet was distraught. Beside herself. She was beside him back then. The boy had been upset by Tilly's absence too, Dan remembered, even though a child himself and still at primary school. He had gone very quiet for weeks afterwards and kept to himself. Malcolm, I'd like to invite them to the farmhouse. Kill a lamb, chill it. We can have a barbecue, chat. Think they will? Taboo and that? They want to visit. They'll be at the opening of the Peace Park. There was another long silence. Janet leaned in the bedroom doorway, studying him. Their two little dogs lay at her feet. Dan blinked. She was gone. The dogs remained, whining and anxious. Malcolm, will you come pray with me? I'd like us to pray together. Yeah, this evening. I'll bring some chops. Dan put the phone away. He picked up a rock from the sun-drenched counter. held it in his hand. It was wonderfully smooth and warm. Dan looked through the window. Malcolm's house was just down the track, across the highway, another gravel turn-off. Not so far. Half a day of walking, perhaps. Not that they'd ever done that. It would be a long walk. Snakes. And between the two houses, closer to the river, was the old farmhouse. The massacre farmhouse, he'd heard people say. Blocks of stone and corrugated iron in the yellow paddock. Now his own house was haunted, and he was glad. Gerald Coolman stepped from the little bus near the top of the main street of King George Town and stood alone to watch it drive away. Now he was out of jail. His lips moved, and he spoke to himself, mouthing words of an ancient language few would recognize. He took several long and deep breaths, calming himself. Feel your skeleton moving inside the flesh. Feel the spaces within. Turning his back on the view of the harbour, he began the walk to the outskirts of town. He did not take the main highway, but one parallel. Nearly an hour later, he came to an intersection near the Aboriginal Centre. How neglected and run down it looked. The first place he went was Auntie Margie's. He didn't knock at the door, but went down the driveway to an open shed, something he'd done many, many times. The young men sitting in the sun at the shed's doorway looked up and smiled. They shook his hand and hugged him. They offered him a dirty plastic bottle with a short piece of plastic inserted in it and a bucket of water. Smoke wreathed the grins and teeth of these brothers, rose from their whiskers and through their hair. Jerry said he was not going to start those old habits again. Found the Lord? No, better than that. They turned away, lowered their heads over the bottle and bucket. Only a bit of weed, a bit of green, not the other stuff. Gerald sat in the doorway of the shed as the others walked away. He breathed lightly. His anxious heart pattered. Their feet crunched gravel spread so thinly between asbestos fence and asbestos house that weeds had punched through. Fibro, people said now, not asbestos. Fibro and weatherboard. Bougainvillea erupted on the fence, lunged at the house and, falling, made an archway. Beyond, at the bright end of the driveway, a car grumbled left to right. Jerry heard the sound of the small stones flicked by its tyres and saw the two pedestrians turn and also exit stage right. This little house, this shabby backyard of weeds, a child's bicycle, a rotary clothes hoist, it felt an enormous space, the big gold sky above. Jerry sat in an old school chair, metal frame, wooden seat. The sun warmed him. He realised he was smiling. Get some work, or an education, find a way to stay off the stuff. After all, he'd managed that inside more than 12 months now. Natural, wanting to celebrate at such a time. He scratched himself. He'd only been inside a few weeks this time, a parole issue, that's all. It had been a disappointment in a way, because on his previous stint his cousin had been running culture classes, workshops, whatever you wanted to call them. A long-timer, Uncle Jim. Willem and boys had looked up to him, and those attending the classes had been mostly his own nephews and cousins and grannies. Another member of the extended family sent Jim word lists, genealogies, language and songs and stories and photos and stuff he was putting together with Old Boy, Jim's dad. One of the screws was helping even. Jim had that knack of enlisting people, women particularly. They were teaching themselves, in prison of all places. They'd memorised vocabulary and listened to recordings of family, most no longer alive. had sat around a whiteboard in their baggy greens while Jimmy played recordings and, there was no getting around it, lectured them. A pyjama party for grown men, but no party food, no women, no grog, not so many laughs, a barren room. Jim's father died. It was best he never saw his boys turn up at the funeral in chains and prison greens. Would have hurt him. His voice was on lots of the recordings. Then Jim himself was gone. Had they only played at respect in that prison cell, listening to Jim? Jim did go on and on. It was true what people said. Every old one left a hole in the world when they died, when they took language with them. That old language was a world itself, and one by one the words let you in. But individuals who could connect you to it, reintroduce you, they were necessary too. Someone needed to step into Jim's shoes. Gerald used to lie flat on his back on his cell bed and let what they called a dead, extinct language roll through his skull. Move his lips and tongue, say the words out loud. Let them reshape him from the inside out. That was under a low ceiling, a prison cell. Now he had this big sky, this fresh breeze. A woman appeared. Nita, Auntie Nita, Nan, old girl, a childhood memory, her cold hands, and the first time a boy looking into her upturned eyeballs. He knew himself alone, consciousness, a single self. The bougainvillea spilling over the doorway had concealed her, so she first appeared as a bloom among the thorns and clinging vine, and then the blank gaze of her sunglasses turned to him. Her long grey hair lifted in the breeze, and her attention reached out to him. The face was expressionless, open to the world, her chin lifted. She held her arms slightly raised, a little in front and out to each side, and the hands palm down. Her tread was very light, and, no doubt her blindness was part of it, there was something tentative about it. A distinct moment when the foot remained poised in the air, not yet committed to that necessary next step. Gerald walked toward her, his footsteps softly crunching, stopped a few metres away, and bid her good day in the old language. "How are you, Jerry?" In the old language, he told her he was well. She tilted her head to one side. "You talking language now? Proper black fella, Anna." He agreed with her, again using the old people's tongue. "You reckon that's our lingo?" He said he did, and went to her. They embraced lightly. She accepted his peck on the cheek. "You happy, Jerry?" "That old me's not who I am now, Auntie. Language, the old culture, that's what Jim showed me. If it helps, my boy, good. But those young girls, Gerald—" "They're safe, Auntie. Don't start that. I never did nothing. That was Jerry, you know that." "You working?" "Will be, but got a camp coming up. Workshop, back to country." "Getting paid?" "Not about the money, my auntie." "In prison? You one of the dancers there last Nadoc?" "Singer, Auntie." "What's it stand for, anyway, that Nadoc?" "Or National Aboriginal and Islander Day of... Committee of... You go? Nadoc Ball?" "Nah." "You ever been to a ball, Gerald?" "Nah." Jerry spoke again in what he believed was the old people's tongue. Then, "That's the real me." Nita raised an eyebrow, a surprising gesture for a blind person, at least for those that did not know her. "Yeah, giving up all that other shit." What did the old girl mean by her little smile, holding her face up all the time like she thinks she is a holy person? "I know my problem," Jerry kept speaking. "Drugs, violence, that's not who I really am." "You going to get in touch with her, Jerry?" "I am. That's what Jim wanted." Nita stood there, head nodding. You've always been good with words and promises, Jerry. More than just words, Auntie.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?